Hello there, and welcome. Tonight we'll be drifting through the quiet corners of France, a land shaped by time, by hands that built cathedrals from stone, by rivers that carved valleys through ancient rock, and by people who turned bread and wine into ceremony. France is more than a place on a map. It is a collection of stories written in landscape and language, in art and architecture, in the slow rhythm of seasons that have turned for thousands of years. As you listen, let your breathing deepen. Let your thoughts slow like a river, finding its way to the sea. There is no need to remember every detail, no test waiting at the end. This is simply a journey, gentle and unhurried, through a country that has given the world so much beauty, so much history, so much quiet wonder. If you enjoy these peaceful explorations, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, just settle in. Let the tension leave your shoulders. Feel the weight of your body sinking softly into rest. France waits for us, patient as always, ready to share its secrets in whispers. Let's begin. The people of France call their country Le Hexagone, the hexagon, a shape both simple and profound. 6 sides meeting in gentle angles that contain an entire world within them. If you were to trace the borders of France with your finger on a map, you would begin at the northern coast where the English Channel meets the land. Your finger would move eastward along Belgium and Luxembourg, then down through Germany, where the Rhine River flows like a silver thread between nations. Further south, the Alps rise, their peaks touching the sky, forming a natural wall between France and Italy and Switzerland. Then your finger would curve westward, following the Mediterranean Sea, where the water is impossibly blue, and the air smells of salt and lavender. The Pyrenees Mountains come next, ancient and weathered, separating France from Spain like a spine of stone. Finally, the Atlantic Ocean stretches along the entire western edge, its waves rolling endlessly against beaches and cliffs that have stood for millennia. Within this hexagon lies approximately 551,695 square kilometers, the largest country in the European Union, large enough to contain snow-capped mountains and sun-baked Mediterranean shores, large enough for dense forests and open plains, large enough for countless villages where church bells mark the passage of time, and cities where millions of lives unfold simultaneously. The hexagonal shape is more than geometry. It is identity. French school children learn it early, seeing their nation not as an irregular form, but as something deliberate, balanced, almost intentional. The shape suggests completeness, a puzzle piece that fits perfectly into itself. This configuration gives France remarkable diversity. Within these 6 sides exist 4 distinct climate zones, from the cool maritime air of Brittany to the warm Mediterranean breezes of Provence. The land contains dramatic contrasts: the flat expanses of the north, the volcanic hills of the Massif Central, the deep river gorges of the south. Geographers note that this hexagonal territory has influenced French culture itself. The nation developed with a sense of natural boundaries, borders defined not by politics alone, but by water and mountain, by the contours the earth itself had carved. Rivers flow inward from these edges, creating pathways for trade and communication that connected regions long before roads were paved. As you imagine this shape, this gentle, six-sided form, let it become a container for your thoughts. Picture it holding centuries of history, generations of lives, the slow accumulation of culture and memory. France is a hexagon, yes, but it is also an idea, a feeling, a place where land and story have become inseparable. France is rare among European nations. Within its borders exist not one climate, but four, each distinct, each shaping the land and people in different ways. In the west and north, the ocean speaks. The Atlantic brings mild temperatures and steady rain throughout the year. Cities like Brest and Nantes know this oceanic climate intimately. Winters there are soft, rarely harsh. Snow is uncommon, a brief visitor rather than a season. Summers remain gentle, warm, but never scorching. The air carries moisture, and green grows easily. This is the climate of Brittany, where Celtic traditions linger in the mist, where ancient standing stones dot the landscape like forgotten sentinels. To the east, the climate changes. Here, the continental influence arrives from the heart of Europe. Strasbourg and Nancy experience this difference profoundly. Winters grow cold, genuinely cold, with frost that glitters on morning grass and snow that stays for weeks. Summers, by contrast, become warm and sometimes hot, the temperature swinging between extremes. The four seasons announce themselves clearly here, each taking its proper turn. The forests of Alsace know this rhythm well, their leaves turning spectacular colors each autumn before falling to the frozen ground of winter. In the south, along the Mediterranean coast, a different world emerges. From Perpignan to Menton, the climate becomes warm and dry. Summers here are long, hot, brilliant with sunshine that bleaches stones white and ripens grapes on endless vines. Rain arrives mostly in winter, when the rest of Europe huddles against cold. This is the climate that inspired painters, that made lavender fields possible, that allowed olive trees to root deeply in rocky soil. The Mistral wind blows here, strong and persistent, clearing the sky to impossible blue. And finally, in the mountains, the Alps and Pyrenees create their own climate entirely. Here, elevation matters more than latitude. Temperatures drop as the land rises toward the sky. Snow arrives early and stays late, sometimes year-round on the highest peaks. Even summer brings cool air at altitude, a refreshing contrast to the valleys below. This is the climate of shepherds and skiers, of glaciers and mountain lakes so clear they seem made of light itself. These four climates exist because France sits at a crossroads. The Atlantic Ocean moderates the west. The European continent influences the east. The Mediterranean warms the south. And the mountains create their own weather, indifferent to the patterns around them. This diversity shapes everything. Wine production thrives because different grapes prefer different conditions. Champagne grows in the cool northeast. Bordeaux flourishes in the oceanic west. Burgundy succeeds in the continental east, and the south produces robust reds under endless sun. Architecture changes too. Northern homes have steep roofs to shed rain. Southern houses feature flat terraces for cool evening air. Eastern buildings are built solid against winter cold. Mountain chalets nestle into slopes, their heavy timbers bearing the weight of snow. Even the language shifts subtly across these zones, dialects colored by climate, by the way weather shapes daily life and long-term memory. France contains multitudes, all held within that gentle hexagonal embrace. Water carves memory into landscape. The Loire River has been doing this work for thousands of years. It is France's longest river, flowing 1,012 kilometers from beginning to end. That is a journey measured not in distance alone, but in transformation, in the slow, patient work of water moving through time. The Loire begins high in the Massif Central, at a place called Montgerbier-de-Jean. Here, at 1,408 meters above the sea, water emerges from volcanic rock, cold and clear and new. The beginning is always quiet, a trickle, a whisper, nothing that suggests the great river this will become. From its source, the Loire travels northward first, gathering strength from tributaries and rain, from snowmelt and springs. It flows through the Ardèche, through landscapes of deep gorges and ancient forests. Gradually, it turns westward, bending in a great arc that will carry it all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. The Loire Valley is where the river truly reveals itself. Here, the water broadens and slows, moving with ancient patience through land that has been cultivated for centuries. This valley, recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site, is home to vineyards and villages, to churches that have stood since medieval times, and to chateaux, magnificent castles built by kings and nobles who understood that beauty and power could coexist. These castles are not fortresses but pleasure palaces, monuments to French Renaissance thought. Chambord, with its impossible double helix staircase. Chenonceau, built across the river itself, its reflection perfect in the water below. Amboise, Azay-le-Rideau, Villandry, with its geometric gardens. The Loire collects these treasures along its banks like memories, flowing past them season after season, century after century. The river changes with the year. In spring, snowmelt from the Massif Central swells its volume, turning it into a powerful force, broad and fast. In late summer, the water drops, revealing vast sandbanks that stretch across the channel like temporary islands. These variations made navigation difficult historically. Boats could travel in spring, but might find themselves stranded by August, waiting for autumn rains to raise the water again. Despite this unpredictability, the Loire served as a vital highway. Goods moved along its length. People traveled its course. Ideas flowed with the current. The river connected interior France to the sea, bringing salt inland and carrying wine outward to the world. Today, the Loire remains largely undammed, allowed to follow its natural rhythm. Wildlife thrives here. Birds by the hundreds of thousands stop during migration. Fish spawn in its shallows. The water maintains its own character, wild, even as civilization builds along its edges. At Saint-Nazaire, the Loire finally reaches the Atlantic, releasing itself into the vast ocean after its long journey. The water that began as a trickle on a volcanic mountain dissolves into salt and tide, completing a cycle older than human memory. There's a place where the earth reaches toward the sky with such determination that snow never melts, where the air grows thin and cold and pure, where silence has weight. Mont Blanc, the White Mountain. At 4,808 meters above sea level, it is the highest peak in the Alps, the highest in Western Europe. But numbers cannot capture what it means to stand in its presence, or even to imagine it from the comfort of your bed, letting your mind wander upward along slopes of ice and stone. The mountain straddles the border between France and Italy, though mountains care nothing for such human distinctions. They were here long before borders, long before names. Mont Blanc rose from the collision of continents, from forces so vast and slow that human time cannot truly comprehend them. The Alps themselves are young as mountains go, still rising, still being shaped by the patient violence of tectonic plates. The summit of Mont Blanc is not rock, but snow and ice, a thick cap that never disappears, though its depth changes with the seasons. In winter, storms add meters to its height. In summer, some melts away, revealing the darker stone beneath in small patches. Scientists measure the summit regularly because the thickness of this ice cap varies, making the mountain's exact height shift by a meter or more from year to year. For centuries, Mont Blanc was considered unclimbable. Local people lived in its shadow, but did not attempt its heights. Mountains were dangerous, inhabited by spirits or dragons, places of avalanche and sudden weather. But in 1786, two men changed this. Jacques Balmat, a guide, and Michel Paccard, a doctor, reached the summit together. Their climb marked the beginning of mountaineering as we know it, the moment when humans decided that even the highest places could be touched. The mountain is not alone. It sits at the heart of the Mont Blanc Massif, surrounded by other peaks, by glaciers that flow like frozen rivers down its flanks, by valleys carved deep into ancient stone. The Mer de Glace, the Sea of Ice, is the largest glacier in France. It stretches 7 kilometers, a river of ice moving so slowly you cannot see its motion, yet moving nonetheless, reshaping the land grain by grain, year by year. Below the mountain, the town of Chamonix nestles in the valley. It has become a place of pilgrimage for those who love high places, who feel called by thin air and distant summits. Climbers, skiers, and those who simply want to stand close to something so immense that it makes human concerns seem small and temporary. The Mont Blanc Tunnel runs beneath the Massif, connecting France and Italy through 11 kilometers of darkness carved through the mountain's heart. Vehicles pass through in minutes, traveling a route that would have taken days of dangerous climbing just generations ago. But the mountain itself remains unchanged by the tunnel below, by the climbers who trace lines up its faces, by the thousands who photograph it from the valley. Mont Blanc endures, white and silent, holding its snow against the sky. Indifferent to time, an island lies in the Mediterranean, closer to Italy than to France, yet French nonetheless. The Corsicans call it Île de Beauté, the island of beauty. And the name is not flattery, but simple truth. Corsica became part of France in 1768, purchased from Genoa just 1 year before Napoleon Bonaparte was born in its capital, Ajaccio. That timing seems significant somehow, as if the island had been waiting to give France its most famous son. The island spans 8,680 square kilometers, the fourth largest in the Mediterranean. But size alone does not capture Corsica. What makes it remarkable is its mountains. Most Mediterranean islands are low and gentle. Corsica rises sharply from the sea, its interior a landscape of granite peaks, deep valleys, and forests that seem to climb toward clouds. Monte Cinto, the highest point, reaches 2,706 meters. This makes Corsica one of the most mountainous islands anywhere in the Mediterranean. The terrain is dramatic, unforgiving, beautiful, in a way that suggests wildness barely contained. Rivers have cut gorges through the rock. Pine and chestnut forests cover slopes. In some places, the mountains descend so steeply to the sea that villages seem to cling to the cliffs. their houses built from the same stone they stand upon. The coastline stretches for more than 1,000 kilometers. Some beaches are sandy and gentle. Others are hidden coves accessible only by boat or steep footpaths. Cliffs rise directly from the water in places, red granite glowing in the afternoon sun. The water itself is clear beyond belief, showing rocks and seagrass far below the surface. Corsica has always maintained its own identity. The language, Corsican, is closer to Italian than French, a reminder of the island's history. Many still speak it, especially in the interior, where tradition holds more strongly than on the coasts. The island has its own music, its own customs, its own sense of itself that exists alongside, but separate from mainland France. The cuisine reflects this independence too. Charcuterie made from pigs that roam semi-wild through the forests, cheeses aged in mountain air, chestnuts ground into flour for bread and cakes, wine from grapes that grow nowhere else. Everything tastes of the island itself, of herbs that grow in rocky soil, of sea wind and mountain cold. Napoleon Bonaparte was born here in 1769, when Corsica had been French for barely a year. He would grow up to reshape Europe, but he never forgot the island. In exile, he spoke of Corsican mountains, of the smell of the maquis, the dense scrubland that covers much of the interior and fills the air with thyme and rosemary. Corsica remains apart, even now. A place where fairies arrive carrying people drawn by beauty, by the promise of mountains that meet the sea, by the feeling that here, somehow, the modern world has not quite arrived. Time moves differently on islands. Corsica knows this well. Where the Rhone River meets the Mediterranean Sea, the land becomes something else entirely. Neither quite river nor quite sea, neither fully solid nor fully liquid. This is the Camargue. The delta covers approximately 930 square kilometers, one of the largest wetlands in Europe. Water moves through it in channels and lagoons, in marshes where reeds grow taller than a person, in shallow pools that evaporate under summer sun, leaving crusts of salt like snow that never melts. The Camargue is famous for three things that seem to belong more to myth than reality: white horses, black bulls, pink flamingos. The horses of the Camargue are born dark, but turn white as they age, their coats bleaching under the sun and salt air. They're small, sturdy, and semi-wild, descended from horses that have lived here since before history was written. They move in herds through the marshes, their hooves splashing through water, their tails swishing at flies. Local guardians, the cowboys of the Camargue, still tend them, though the horses need little tending. They know this land better than any human. The bulls are raised for the traditional courses, camargueses, a form of bullfighting unique to this region. Unlike Spanish bullfighting, the bull is not killed, but challenged, and the skill lies in snatching ribbons tied to its horns. The bulls are respected here, treated as partners in a dance that tests bravery on both sides. And the flamingos, thousands of them, sometimes tens of thousands, gathering in the shallow lagoons. They are one of the few places in Europe where these birds breed. The color comes from their diet, from tiny shrimp and algae, rich in carotenoids that turn their feathers, shades of pink and salmon. When they gather in large flocks, the water itself seems to turn pink, a living carpet of birds moving in slow synchronization. The Camargue has been shaped by human hands as much as by nature. Romans harvested salt here 2,000 years ago. Medieval monks drained parts of the marsh to create farmland. Rice has been grown here since the Middle Ages, making the Camargue the primary rice-producing region of France. The salt pans, or salins, still operate today, their geometric pools reflecting sky and producing the fleur de sel that chefs prize. Much of the Camargue is now protected as a natural reserve, established in 1970 to preserve this unique ecosystem. The balance here is delicate. Fresh water from the Rhône meets salt water from the Mediterranean. Too much of either disrupts everything. The land needs both river and sea, both flood and drought, both stillness and storm. Traditional houses dot the landscape, small and white with roofs that used to be thatched with reeds. They sit low to the ground, built to withstand the mistral, the strong north wind that sweeps through the region, bringing cold air and clearing the sky to brilliant blue. The Camargue feels like the edge of the world, a place where elements mix, where boundaries blur, where the earth is still deciding what it wants to become. The Alps form a wall along France's southeastern border, a rampart of stone and ice separating France from Switzerland and Italy. To see them is to understand why empires stopped here, why armies turned back, why even today, these mountains command respect. The French Alps encompass peaks that scrape the sky, glaciers that flow like frozen rivers, valleys carved so deep that sunlight reaches the bottom only a few hours each day. This is dramatic country, where the earth's bones show through thin soil, where life clings to rock faces and struggles against wind and cold. The region was not always French. Savoie and Haute-Savoie, the two departments that contain most of the French Alps, only joined France in 1860. Before that, they belonged to the Kingdom of Sardinia. The people here spoke French, yes, but also Italian and local dialects that belonged to neither. Some traditions still reflect this complex history, this sense of being caught between larger powers. The valleys have their own characters. Chamonix, in the shadow of Mont Blanc, has become synonymous with mountaineering and extreme skiing. Maurienne and Tarentaise are working valleys, where hydroelectric dams harness glacier melt, where villages cluster around churches whose bells mark the hours. Winter transforms the Alps into one vast playground. Ski resorts like Val d'Isère, Courchevel, and Maribel attract visitors from around the world, drawn by reliable snow and slopes that challenge even the most skilled. The industry is massive, the infrastructure impressive. Cable cars rise thousands of meters. Grooming machines work through the night to prepare runs. Towns that were once farming villages now exist primarily to serve skiers. But summer reveals a different character. When snow melts, the Alps become a haven for hikers. Trails wind through meadows carpeted with wildflowers, alpine flowers so vibrant they seem impossible. Blues and yellows and purples, covering slopes where just weeks before only snow existed. The sound changes too. Water is everywhere, rushing in streams, dripping from rocks, filling the air with the constant music of snowmelt finding its way downward. The Tour du Mont Blanc is one of the world's great hiking routes. It circles the Mont Blanc Massif, crossing through France, Italy, and Switzerland. The trail takes about 10 days to complete, passing through valleys and over mountain passes, through forests and across boulder fields, always with the great peaks visible in the distance. Ecology shifts dramatically with altitude. Below 1,000 meters, deciduous forests grow, oak and beech. Higher, conifers take over, spruce and fir that can withstand cold. Above the tree line, only grasses and small plants survive. And finally, above 3,000 meters, nothing grows at all. Only rock and ice remain, the realm where life cannot persist. The Alps are not gentle. They demand respect. But for those who love high places, they offer something that cannot be found anywhere else. Along the southern border of France runs another mountain range, less famous than the Alps, but equally formidable. The Pyrenees stretch 430 kilometers from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea, forming a natural barrier between France and Spain. Unlike the Alps, which have numerous roads and tunnels crossing them, the Pyrenees have fewer passages. The mountains here are older, geologically speaking, formed during the Hercynian orogeny, hundreds of millions of years ago, then uplifted again during the same tectonic events that created the Alps. This double birth gives them their character, worn smooth in places, jagged in others. The highest peak on the French side is Vignemale, reaching 3,298 meters. Not as high as Mont Blanc, but impressive nonetheless. The mountains here feel different from the Alps. They are less developed, less commercialized. Villages remain small and traditional. Tourism exists, but does not dominate. These are working mountains, where shepherds still take flocks to high pastures in summer, following rhythms established centuries ago. The Pyrenees are divided into 3 French departments: Pyrénées-Atlantiques in the west, where Basque culture thrives, and the ocean influence brings rain and green. Haute-Pyrénées in the center, with Lourdes, the famous pilgrimage site where millions come each year seeking healing, and Pyrénées-Orientales in the east, where the climate becomes Mediterranean, where vines grow on sunny slopes, and the air smells of herbs. Wildlife still roams these mountains. The Pyrenean brown bear, nearly extinct, was reintroduced in the 1990s and now maintains a small but growing population. Icerds, a species of mountain goat, leap across cliffs that seem impossible to climb. Golden eagles nest in high crags. Marmots whistle from their burrows. The mountains still belong partly to wildness. The Western Pyrenees are home to Basque culture, which predates both France and Spain. The Basque language, Euskara, is unrelated to French or Spanish or any known language family. It is a mystery, a survivor from a time before Indo-European languages spread across Europe. In Basque villages, red and white painted houses line narrow streets. Pelota, the traditional Basque ball game, is still played against church walls. The culture persists, protected by geography, by the mountains that made this region difficult to conquer or fully assimilate. Snow falls heavily in winter, creating conditions for skiing, though the resorts here are smaller and quieter than those in the Alps. Summer brings shepherds to high pastures where sheep graze on alpine meadows. The cheese made from this summer milk, aged in caves carved into mountainsides, has been produced the same way for generations. Rivers rush down from Pyrenean peaks, cutting gorges through limestone. Some of these gorges contain caves where prehistoric humans painted images of animals, of hands pressed against stone. Messages from people who lived here 15,000 years ago. Who knew these mountains intimately, who watched the same peaks catch the light of dawn. The Pyrenees keep their secrets well. They are mountains that still feel remote, that reward those who approach them with patience and respect. France is not confined to Europe. Scattered across the world's oceans, remnants of a former empire remain, no longer colonies, but integral parts of France itself. The sun never sets on French territory, a phrase once used for empires that now applies to this modern republic. In South America, French Guiana covers 83,534 square kilometers of tropical rainforest. It is not an overseas territory in name, but an overseas department, as much a part of France as Paris or Lyon. People here vote in French elections, use the euro, send representatives to the National Assembly. From its capital, Cayenne, administration reaches into dense jungle where indigenous communities maintain ancient ways alongside modern French infrastructure. French Guiana hosts the Guiana Space Center, Europe's primary spaceport. Here, where the equator's rotational velocity provides extra boost to rockets, Ariane launches Rise on pillars of flame, carrying satellites toward orbit. The contrast is striking. Ancient rainforest and cutting-edge technology existing side by side, separated by just a few kilometers. In the Caribbean, islands scattered across turquoise water remain French. Martinique and Guadeloupe are overseas departments, their economies based on tourism, sugarcane, and bananas. The beaches are perfect, white sand and palm trees leaning over water so clear you can see fish swimming meters below the surface. Volcanoes rise from the island's centers, some dormant, some still active. Mount Pelée in Martinique erupted in 1902, destroying the city of Saint-Pierre and killing nearly all its inhabitants in minutes. The mountain still smokes occasionally, a reminder that beauty and danger often share the same space. Saint Martin and Saint Barthélemy, smaller islands, are overseas collectivities with special status. Saint Martin is unusual because it is divided between France and the Netherlands, two nations sharing one small island in surprising harmony. In the Indian Ocean, east of Madagascar, lies Réunion. The island is dominated by Piton de la Fournaise, one of the world's most active volcanoes. It erupts regularly, sending rivers of lava flowing down toward the sea, creating new land where ocean meets molten rock. The eruptions are usually not violent, allowing people to watch from safe distances as the earth literally recreates itself. The island's culture is a blend of African, Indian, Chinese, and French influences. Its cuisine, a fusion that reflects centuries of migration. The Pacific holds France's largest overseas presence. French Polynesia encompasses 118 islands spread across an area the size of Europe, though the total land area is small. Tahiti, Bora Bora. These names evoke paradise, islands of volcanic peaks and coral lagoons of traditional Polynesian culture, maintained alongside French language and law. New Caledonia, also in the Pacific, possesses vast nickel reserves that make it economically significant. The indigenous Kanak people have pushed for independence, and referendums have been held, though so far, the territory has chosen to remain French. These scattered territories mean France maintains a presence in every ocean, in every time zone from UTC 10 to UTC plus 12. They provide exclusive economic zones in surrounding waters, giving France access to marine resources across vast distances. But more than resources, they represent connections, threads of history and language reaching around the globe, tying distant shores to a hexagon in Western Europe. In the heart of France rises a vast plateau, ancient and worn, covering 1/6 of the entire country. The Massif Central is not dramatic like the Alps or Pyrenees. Its peaks are rounded, its slopes gentle. But this subtlety hides a violent past. The Massif Central is volcanic, not recently, not dangerously, but unmistakably. The landscape remembers fire, remembers a time when the Earth's crust was thin here, when magma pushed upward and erupted across the land. The chaîne de Puy demonstrates this history most clearly. A chain of approximately 80 volcanoes running north to south, their cones perfectly preserved. Some are bare, their slopes covered only in grass. Others support forests. Puy de Dôme, the most famous, rises 1,465 meters, its summit accessible by road and offering views that stretch to the Alps on clear days. These volcanoes are young, geologically speaking. Some erupted as recently as 6,000 years ago. Not yesterday, but not ancient either. The possibility of future eruptions exists, though scientists consider it unlikely in any human time frame. Still, the land remains restless. Hot springs bubble up in places, mineral water rich in dissolved gases, proof that heat still lingers deep below. The highest point of the Massif Central is Puy de Sancy at 1,186 meters, not towering, but commanding nonetheless. In winter, snow covers its summit. Skiers come, though the resorts here are small, local affairs rather than international destinations. Summer brings hikers seeking gentler climbs than the Alps offer, paths through forests and across meadows where cattle graze. The Massif Central has traditionally been one of France's more isolated regions. Roads wind through valleys rather than cutting straight across plateaus. Villages remain small, populations declining as young people leave for cities. The economy relies on agriculture and forestry, on raising cattle and sheep, on cutting timber from forests that have been managed for generations. But this region gives France some of its finest cheeses. Saint-Nectaire, creamy and aromatic. Cantal, firm and complex. Bleu d'Auvergne, veined with blue mold and sharp on the tongue. These cheeses are made from milk produced by cattle that spend summers in high pastures, grazing on diverse grasses and flowers that give the milk distinctive flavors. The cheese-making process follows traditions established centuries ago, recipes passed down through families. The landscape includes dramatic features beyond volcanoes. The Gorges du Tarn cuts through limestone plateaus, a canyon up to 500 meters deep. The Tarn River flows through its bottom, green and cold. Rock climbers scale the vertical walls. Kayakers navigate the river. Vultures circle overhead, reintroduced after being hunted to extinction, now thriving again in this wild place. The Massif Central is quiet France, interior France, the part tourists often overlook. But it holds its own beauty, subtle and enduring. In 1940, 4 teenagers and a dog discovered something extraordinary in the Dordogne region of southwestern France. They found a cave, not unusual in limestone country, but this cave held secrets 17,000 years old. The walls of Lascaux are covered with paintings, nearly 6,000 figures, mostly animals. Horses gallop across stone. Deer leap. Aurochs, huge wild cattle now extinct, dominate entire chambers with their massive forms. The paintings use natural pigments, iron oxide for reds and yellows, manganese oxide for black. The colors remain vivid even after all these millennia. What strikes viewers first is the quality. These are not crude stick figures or simple outlines. The artists understood anatomy, understood movement, understood how to use the contours of the cave walls to give their images dimension. A bulge in the rock becomes a horse's muscular shoulder. A depression suggests depth. The paintings demonstrate sophistication that seems impossible for their age. The most famous chamber is the Hall of the Bulls. Here, enormous aurochs stretch across the ceiling, some over 5 meters long. They seem to move in the flickering light of torches, the same light the original artists worked by. That flicker may have been intentional. Animation before animation existed. Images that came alive when fire danced. Why did they paint? No one knows with certainty. Perhaps for hunting magic, to ensure success by capturing the prey's image first. Perhaps for ceremony, rituals we can only guess at. Perhaps for teaching, showing children what animals looked like, how they moved, where to strike them. Perhaps simply for beauty, for the joy of creation, for the same reason humans still make art today. The artists worked deep in the caves, far from daylight. They brought lamps, animal fat burned in stone cups. They climbed, sometimes building scaffolding to reach high walls. They mixed pigments, ground minerals, added water or animal fat to make paint flow. They used their fingers, used brushes made from animal hair or plant fibers, used the technique of blowing pigment through hollow bones to create spray effects. After the cave's discovery, it was opened to the public. Thousands visited each year, drawn by the beauty and antiquity. But human breath changed the cave's atmosphere. Carbon dioxide and moisture encouraged algae and crystal growth. The paintings began to deteriorate. In 1963, the decision was made to close Lascaux to protect it. That could have been the end of the story. But France created a replica. Lascaux II opened in 1983. Artists and technicians reproduced the paintings with painstaking accuracy on concrete walls molded to match the cave's contours exactly. More recently, Lascaux IV, using even more advanced technology, opened in 2016. Now, visitors can experience the wonder without damaging the original. The real Lascaux remains sealed, accessible only to researchers who enter rarely and briefly. The paintings rest in darkness, as they did for most of their existence. The horses still gallop, the bulls still charge, the deer still leap. Frozen in pigment and stone, they wait, images created by hands and minds remarkably like our own, messages sent across time from people who looked at the world and decided to capture what they saw, to leave something beautiful behind. Before France was France, it was Gaul, the land between the Rhine, the Alps, the Pyrenees, and the Atlantic Ocean, home to Celtic tribes who fought each other and farmed the land and worked metal with skill that impressed even Rome. Julius Caesar changed everything. From 58 to 50 BCE, he led Roman legions in the conquest of Gaul. The Gallic tribes were brave, their warriors fierce. But Rome had discipline, superior tactics, engineering skills that built siege works and bridges faster than the Gauls thought possible. Caesar documented his campaigns in detailed commentaries, writing that would survive and be studied for 2,000 years. The conquest was brutal. Entire tribes were destroyed. Some estimates suggest over 1 million Gauls died, another million enslaved. But Roman rule, once established, brought stability and prosperity that would last 5 centuries. Roman Gaul became one of the empire's most valuable provinces. The Romans built extensively. Roads connected every major settlement, straight and well-maintained, allowing armies and merchants to travel quickly. Aqueducts carried water to cities, engineering marvels like the Pont de Gare, a three-tiered bridge near Nimes that still stands, still inspires awe. Cities grew or were founded. Lugdunum, modern Lyon, became the capital of Gaul. Massive amphitheaters were constructed where gladiators fought and crowds roared. Theaters hosted plays. Public baths became centers of social life. The Romans brought urban living to a land that had been largely rural. Latin replaced the various Celtic languages, gradually but thoroughly. The Gallic languages faded, survived only in a few words absorbed into Latin. That Latin would eventually evolve into French, shaped by later Germanic influences, but fundamentally Roman in structure and vocabulary. Roman law and administration created frameworks that would outlast the empire itself. The concept of written legal codes, of bureaucracy, of organized government, these became embedded in the land. Christianity arrived during the Roman period, spreading slowly at first, then more rapidly after Constantine's conversion in the 4th century. By the time Rome fell, Gaul was largely Christian, and that faith would shape French culture for the next 1,500 years. The empire's end came gradually in Gaul. Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine in increasing numbers. The Franks, one of these tribes, eventually gave their name to France. They conquered Gaul not as destroyers, but as settlers, adopting Roman ways, converting to Christianity, creating a synthesis of Germanic and Roman culture that became medieval France. Roman ruins dot France still. Amphitheaters in Nimes and Arles still host events. Aqueducts stand as testament to engineering skill. In Orange, a Roman theater maintains acoustics so perfect that performances are still held there. Underground, in cities across France, Roman foundations support medieval and modern buildings, layers of history built one upon another. The Roman period gave France its language, its legal traditions, its first Christian communities, and infrastructure that would serve for centuries. The conquest was violent, but what followed transformed the land completely. In the late 8th century, one man united much of Western Europe under his rule: Charlemagne, Charles the Great, king of the Franks, conqueror, administrator, patron of learning. A figure so significant that both France and Germany claim him as a founder. Charlemagne became king in 768, sharing power initially with his brother. When his brother died, he became sole ruler and immediately began expanding his kingdom through military campaigns. He conquered the Lombards in Italy. He pushed into Spain, though less successfully. He fought the Saxons for decades, eventually forcing their conversion to Christianity and incorporation into his realm. His empire eventually encompassed most of Western and Central Europe, from the Pyrenees to the Baltic, from the Atlantic to modern Hungary. Charlemagne ruled territory not united since Rome fell. His power was recognized in the year 800 when Pope Leo III crowned him Emperor of the Romans on Christmas Day. The ceremony in Rome symbolically revived the Western Roman Empire, though what emerged was something new, neither fully Roman nor fully Germanic, but a synthesis. But Charlemagne was more than a conqueror. He initiated what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of learning and culture. He gathered scholars from across Europe to his court at Aachen. He established schools, insisting that clergy and administrators should be educated. He standardized religious practices, creating unity across his diverse territories. Charlemagne himself could not read or write until late in life, if ever successfully. But he understood education's importance. He promoted literacy, had important texts copied and preserved, reformed handwriting into a more legible script that became the basis for later fonts. Without this preservation effort, many classical Latin texts would have been lost forever. He standardized weights and measures, making trade easier. He reformed currency. He improved agricultural production through better organization of estates. His administrators kept detailed written records, creating a bureaucracy that functioned with surprising efficiency for its time. After his death in 814, his empire proved too large for his heirs to hold together. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 divided it among his 3 grandsons. The western portion became the foundation of France. The eastern portion evolved into what would become Germany. The Middle Kingdom, stretching from the Netherlands to Italy, became a source of conflict for over 1,000 years. Charlemagne's legacy is complex. He was brutal in conquest, particularly against the Saxons, but he created administrative systems and cultural initiatives that shaped European development for centuries. He promoted Christian unity while allowing some diversity in local practices. He balanced military might with cultural patronage. His court at Aachen became legendary. Scholars, poets, and theologians gathered there, creating an intellectual community unmatched in Western Europe since Rome's fall. The palace chapel still stands, its architecture reflecting Byzantine and Roman influences, a physical reminder of Charlemagne's ambition to recreate imperial grandeur. Both French and German national narratives claim Charlemagne. He is Karl der Grosse in German, Charlemagne in French. His empire's division created the foundation for both nations, though neither would emerge in recognizable form for centuries. His influence on European political thought, on concepts of kingship and empire, on the relationship between church and state, echoed through the Middle Ages and beyond. In his own time, he was called the Father of Europe. The title still fits. In the year 911, a Viking leader named Rollo stood before the French king Charles the Simple. They made an agreement that would echo through centuries. Rollo would receive land along the northern coast of France in exchange for protecting it from other Viking raids and swearing loyalty to the king. The land became known as Normandy, land of the Northmen. The Vikings who settled there were fierce warriors and skilled sailors, but they adapted quickly to their new home. Within a generation, they spoke French. Within 2, they'd adopted Christianity and French customs. Yet they retained something of their Viking heritage. That combination of French culture and Norse determination would prove formidable. By the 11th century, Normandy had become one of France's most powerful duchies. Its rulers owed allegiance to the French king for their Norman lands, but they were powerful enough to be nearly independent. Then came William, Duke of Normandy, who claimed the English throne through a distant familial connection. In 1066, William crossed the English Channel with an army. He met the English King Harold at Hastings. The battle lasted 1 day. Harold died, struck in the eye by an arrow according to legend. William became King of England, forever known as William the Conqueror. This created a peculiar situation. The Duke of Normandy, a vassal of the French king, now also ruled England as an independent monarch. He was simultaneously subject and equal, servant and sovereign. This tangled relationship would plague England and France for centuries. Norman French became the language of the English court and nobility. For nearly 300 years, England's rulers spoke French, not English. The peasants spoke English, the nobles spoke French, and slowly, inevitably, the languages merged. Thousands of French words entered English, particularly in areas of government, law, military affairs, and cuisine. Words like parliament, justice, soldier, beef, pork. The English language became a hybrid, Germanic in structure, but with enormous French vocabulary. English kings continued to hold lands in France, sometimes vast territories. At one point, the English crown controlled more of France than the French king himself. This led to wars, endless wars, culminating in the 100 Years' War that would devastate both kingdoms. The Norman influence on England was profound. They built castles, great stone fortresses that dominated the landscape. They restructured government, introducing feudal systems and detailed record-keeping. The Domesday Book, compiled 20 years after the conquest, recorded every landholding in England with meticulous detail. Norman architecture filled England, their rounded arches and massive pillars creating churches and cathedrals that still stand. But the Norman connection meant that English and French history remained intertwined for centuries. Marriages between royal families, wars over French territories, cultural exchange that flowed both directions. The Norman conquest didn't just change England. It bound England and France together in ways that shaped both nations' development. Today, William the Conqueror's tomb lies in Caen, Normandy. His skeleton, disturbed repeatedly through history, rests under a simple stone marker. From this northern coast, Vikings became Normans, and Normans changed the world. It did not last exactly 100 years. It lasted 116, from 1337 to 1453. And it was not one continuous war, but a series of conflicts, interrupted by truces and uneasy peace. Yet the name persists, capturing something essential about this long struggle between England and France. The war began over succession. When the French king died without a direct male heir, Edward III of England claimed the throne through his mother, who was the previous king's daughter. The French rejected this claim, citing Salic law, which prohibited inheritance through the female line. They crowned Philip VI instead. Edward refused to accept this, and war began. The early decades went badly for France. English longbowmen devastated French knights at Crécy in 1346. The English won again at Poitiers in 1356, capturing the French king himself. French prestige collapsed. The kingdom seemed on the verge of dissolution. The Black Death interrupted everything. The plague swept through Europe, beginning in 1347, killing perhaps a third of the population. War paused as both sides struggled simply to survive. When fighting resumed, the dynamics had changed. Labor shortages empowered peasants. Social structures weakened. The old certainties of medieval life crumbled. By 1420, things looked hopeless for France. The Treaty of Troyes effectively disinherited the French crown prince, declaring that England's king would inherit France. Northern France was occupied. The legitimate heir, the Dauphin Charles, controlled only a fraction of his kingdom and seemed unable to reverse his fortunes. Then came Joan of Arc. But that is another story, one deserving its own telling. For now, know only that she changed everything, that her brief intervention gave France hope when hope seemed lost. The war's final phase saw France gradually recover territory. Improved artillery made medieval castles obsolete. The French developed professional armies rather than relying on feudal levies. New tactics emerged. Slowly, methodically, English holdings in France were recaptured. The war ended not with a treaty, but with exhaustion. The English, worn down by military defeats and political instability at home, simply could not continue. By 1453, they retained only Calais on French soil. Everything else was lost. The 100 Years' War transformed both nations. France emerged with a stronger sense of national identity, having united against a common enemy. The monarchy centralized power, developing institutions that would characterize the French state for centuries. The nobility's military dominance ended, replaced by professional soldiers and artillery. England turned inward after defeat. Its ambitions in France permanently ended. The Wars of the Roses, a civil war over succession, consumed English attention for the next 30 years. When England finally looked outward again, it would be toward oceans rather than continental Europe. The war devastated the French countryside. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, populations displaced or killed. Some regions took generations to recover. But from this destruction emerged modern France, a kingdom with defined borders, a sense of national purpose, and administrative structures capable of governing effectively. The medieval world, with its assumptions about knightly warfare and feudal loyalty, died during these 116 years. What emerged was something new, something closer to the nation-states we would recognize today. The transformation was violent, costly, and irreversible. She was a peasant girl from Domremy, a village on the border between France and Lorraine. Born around 1412, she grew up during the darkest period of the 100 Years' War, when it seemed France would cease to exist as an independent kingdom. At 13, she began hearing voices. She identified them as Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. They gave her a mission. She must go to the Dauphin, the uncrowned heir to the French throne. She must help him reclaim his kingdom. She must see him crowned at Rheims. For 3 years, she resisted. She was a girl, uneducated, without wealth or connections. How could she possibly fulfill such a mission? But the voices persisted, and finally, at 16, she convinced a local garrison commander to give her an escort to the Dauphin's court. The Dauphin Charles was skeptical, but desperate. He had lost most of his kingdom. His own legitimacy was questioned. He had nothing to lose by listening to this strange girl who claimed divine guidance. He gave her armor, troops, and permission to join the relief force heading to Orléans. Orléans was under English siege. Its fall would open the Loire Valley to English conquest. The city's survival mattered strategically and symbolically. Joan arrived with the relief force in April 1429. Her presence electrified the defenders. She led attacks with surprising tactical sense, inspiring soldiers who had been close to despair. Within 9 days, the siege was lifted. The impossible had happened. More victories followed. The French army, with Joan riding at its front, pushed northward. She was wounded twice, but returned to fighting as soon as she could stand. Her courage was absolute, her conviction unshakable. soldiers followed her because she seemed touched by something beyond the ordinary. In July 1429, just 3 months after Orléans, the Dauphin was crowned King Charles VII at Reims Cathedral. Joan stood beside him, her mission apparently complete. She could have retired, then returned to her village, lived quietly. But the voices, she said, told her to continue. The following year, she was captured during a skirmish near Compiègne. The Burgundians, French nobles allied with England, sold her to the English. Charles VII made no serious attempt to ransom or rescue her. The girl who had given him his crown was abandoned to her enemies. The English wanted her dead, but needed legal justification. They arranged a trial for heresy. The charge was nonsensical, based largely on her wearing men's clothing and claiming divine communication. The trial was predetermined. She defended herself with remarkable intelligence and courage, but the outcome was decided before it began. In May 1431, not yet 20 years old, Joan was burned at the stake in Rouen market square. Her ashes were thrown into the Seine River, so no relics could be collected. The English hoped to erase her, to prove she was a heretic and witch, to demoralize French resistance. They failed. Her martyrdom made her more powerful than her life had. She became a symbol of French resistance, of faith against impossible odds, of courage that transcends reasonable calculation. 25 years later, a new trial cleared her name. Centuries later, she was canonized as a saint. Joan of Arc changed history in less than 2 years of active involvement. The peasant girl who heard voices became France's eternal symbol of hope against darkness. West of Paris, where marshland once spread, rises the most famous palace in the world. Versailles began modestly, a hunting lodge built by Louis XIII. His son, Louis XIV, the Sun King, transformed it into something unprecedented, a monument to absolute monarchy, a physical manifestation of power and glory. Construction began in 1661 and continued for decades. Tens of thousands of workers labored on the palace, the gardens, the infrastructure required to support such an immense project. The cost was staggering, so enormous that Louis XIV ordered financial records destroyed to hide the true expense. Some estimates suggest 3% of France's annual revenue went to Versailles for over 20 years. The palace itself sprawls across vast space, 700 rooms, 67 staircases, more than 2,000 windows. The Hall of Mirrors alone stretches 73 meters, its 17 mirror-clad arches, reflecting light from 17 windows overlooking the gardens. In an age when mirrors were expensive luxuries, this display represented almost unimaginable wealth. But the palace was more than architecture. It was a machine for controlling the nobility. Louis XIV required nobles to spend part of each year at Versailles, attending elaborate court ceremonies. Every moment of the king's day became ritual. Nobles competed for the honor of helping him dress, of holding his candle at bedtime, of watching him eat. These ceremonies served a purpose. They kept the nobility busy with trivialities, focused on court politics rather than building independent power bases. The gardens, designed by André Le Nôtre, are perhaps more impressive than the palace itself. They cover 800 hectares, filled with geometric patterns, sculpted hedges, fountains, and groves. Water had to be pumped from the Seine River kilometers away because the local water supply was insufficient for the hundreds of fountains Louis XIV demanded. The engineering required was extraordinary for the 17th century. Versailles hosted legendary parties. In 1668, Louis XIV held a feast for 600 guests that lasted several days. Fireworks illuminated the sky. Plays were performed. The finest foods and wines were served in quantities that seemed designed to demonstrate abundance beyond need. The palace became the model for royal residences across Europe. Kings and princes tried to imitate it, creating their own versions, but none matched the original scale or influence. Louis XIV moved the government to Versailles in 1682, making it the official seat of power. Paris remained the capital in name, but real authority resided in this palace in the countryside. The move increased the king's control by distancing government from the unpredictable Parisian population. Later, kings continued to live at Versailles, though none matched Louis XIV's commitment to its symbolism. Louis XV made modifications. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette lived there until the Revolution forced them back to Paris. The Revolution saw Versailles ransacked. Furniture was sold, art dispersed. The palace narrowly escaped destruction. Napoleon considered demolishing it, but it survived, and in the 19th century, Louis-Philippe transformed it into a museum dedicated to the glory of France, a role it still serves. Today, millions visit Versailles each year. They walk through the Hall of Mirrors, where the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919, ending World War I. They wander the gardens, where fountains still dance to music. They glimpse a world of absolute monarchy, of power made visible in stone and gold and glass. Versailles remains what Louis XIV intended, unforgettable. The Loire Valley holds more than 300 chateaux, castles that range from medieval fortresses to Renaissance pleasure palaces. They line the river like pearls on a string, each one telling stories of war, politics, romance, and artistic ambition. Some began as fortifications. Chinon, perched on a rocky outcrop, dates to the Middle Ages. Its walls are thick, designed to withstand siege. Joan of Arc met the Dauphin here in 1429, in halls that still echo with history. The fortress sprawls across the hilltop, its towers watching the river below, as they have for centuries. But most Loire chateaux were built or rebuilt during the Renaissance, when French kings and nobles returned from Italian campaigns enchanted by Renaissance art and architecture. They wanted beauty, not just strength. Defense became secondary to elegance. Chambord is the most extraordinary. Built for Francois the Rare beginning in 1519, it has 440 rooms, 282 fireplaces, and 84 staircases. The roof is a forest of chimneys and turrets, decorative rather than functional. The famous double helix staircase at the center may have been designed by Leonardo da Vinci, who was living in France at the time. Two staircases wind around each other without meeting, allowing people to ascend and descend simultaneously without crossing paths. Chenonceau bridges the river Cher, built directly over the water. The gallery stretches across the river, its arches reflected perfectly in the water below. Women shaped Chenonceau's history. Catherine de' Medici, Diane de Poitiers, and later owners each left their mark, creating gardens and interiors that reflect feminine sensibilities rare in royal architecture. Amboise sits above the Loire, where Leonardo da Vinci spent his final years living in a nearby manor. The castle was a favorite residence of several French kings. Charles VIII died here after striking his head on a low doorway, a prosaic end for a monarch. Leonardo's tomb lies in the castle's chapel, though whether his bones are actually there remains uncertain. Azay-le-Rideau rises from an island in the Indre River, surrounded by water on all sides. Its reflection creates perfect symmetry. Built in the early 16th century, it represents the transition from fortress to residence, with decorative machicolations that could never serve defensive purposes. Villandry is famous not for its architecture, but for its gardens, restored in the early 20th century to their original Renaissance design. Geometric patterns of boxwood contain vegetables arranged by color and texture. Flowers form intricate designs visible from the chateau's upper windows. The gardens are maintained by a staff of gardeners who work year-round. These chateaux were never merely homes. They were statements of wealth, taste, and power. They demonstrated that France could match Italy in artistic achievement. They provided stages for court life, for political maneuvering, for the subtle dance of favor and influence that determined careers and fortunes. Today, they offer glimpses into a world of absolute monarchy, of artistic patronage, of life lived at a scale and luxury that seems almost impossible. Yet the stones remain, and the gardens still bloom, and the Loire flows past as it has for millennia. In the 12th and 13th centuries, a religious movement spread through southern France that would challenge the Catholic Church's authority and lead to one of the bloodiest crusades in history. The Cathars believed in a dualistic universe, that the material world was created by evil and only the spiritual realm was good. They rejected Catholic sacraments, lived simply, and denied the Church's power. The movement flourished in Languedoc, the region around Toulouse. Local nobles protected Cathars, sometimes out of belief, sometimes for political reasons. The area had its own language, Occitan, its own culture, and had always maintained some independence from the French crown in the north. Pope Innocent III declared a crusade against the Cathars in 1209, not a crusade to the Holy Land, but against fellow Christians in France. Northern French nobles joined eagerly, attracted by the promise of southern lands and plunder. The crusade lasted 20 years and devastated the south. The Siege of Béziers in 1209 set the tone. When the city was taken, the Crusaders massacred inhabitants indiscriminately. When asked how to distinguish Cathars from Catholics, the papal legate reportedly said, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Whether he actually said this is debated, but the phrase captures the Crusade's brutality. Carcassonne fell next. Its fortifications were formidable, its double walls seeming impregnable. But siege and thirst forced surrender. The inhabitants were expelled wearing only their clothing, and the city was given to Simon de Montfort, the Crusade's military leader. The Cathars retreated to mountain fortresses. These castles perched on peaks so steep they seemed unreachable. Montségur, Pérepertus, Caribous, the names still carry echoes of desperate resistance. Montségur held out the longest. Built on a rocky peak in the Pyrenees, it seemed invincible. But a siege lasting 10 months finally forced surrender in 1244. More than 200 Cathars, refusing to renounce their faith, were burned alive in a field below the fortress. The site is still called the Field of the Burned. The crusade accomplished its goal. Catharism was destroyed, its believers killed or forced into hiding. The last known Cathar Perfect, their version of clergy, was burned in 1321. The movement disappeared, leaving only ruins and memories. But the castles remain. Montségur's walls still cling to their impossible peak. Peyrepertus sprawls along a mountain ridge, its stones golden in the setting sun. Caribus perches above the valley, watching over land that remembers blood and fire. These fortresses were rebuilt or reinforced by French kings after the Crusade, becoming part of the border, defenses against Spain. But their earlier history haunts them. They stand as monuments to faith that would not compromise, to a culture that was erased, to a time when religious difference meant death. The wind that blows through their empty towers carries silence now. But once, it carried prayers in Occitan, languages of a people who believed differently and paid the ultimate price. In 1119, a group of 9 knights formed in Jerusalem to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. History knows them as the Knights Templar. The order grew rapidly. Donations poured in from across Europe. The Templars became wealthy and powerful, developing a network of fortresses, farms, and preceptories. They became bankers, creating an early form of international finance. A person could deposit money at one Templar house and withdraw it at another hundreds of miles away, avoiding the danger of traveling with gold. In France, the Templars established their headquarters in Paris. The temple, their fortress in the city, became a center of financial and political power. French kings borrowed money from the Templars. The royal treasury was sometimes housed there because it was considered more secure than the king's own palace. For nearly 2 centuries, the Templars thrived. They fought in the Crusades with legendary courage. Their white mantles with red crosses became symbols of Christian military power. But their success bred resentment and envy. By the early 14th century, the Crusades had failed. The last Christian strongholds in the Holy Land had fallen. The Templars, without their original mission, seemed purposeless, and they were very, very wealthy. King Philip IV of France was deeply in debt to the Templars. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, he struck. In a coordinated operation across France, Templars were arrested simultaneously. The charges were shocking: heresy, idol worship, desecrating the cross, obscene rituals. The trials that followed used torture extensively. Under duress, some Templars confessed to the accusations. Others maintained innocence. The process dragged on for years. Pope Clement V, pressured by Philip, officially dissolved the order in 1312. In 1314, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars, was burned at the stake in Paris. According to legend, as the flames rose, he cursed both the king and the pope, summoning them to meet him before God's judgment within a year. Both died within that time, though whether curse or coincidence, history cannot say. The Templars' wealth was supposedly transferred to another military order, the Hospitallers, but much disappeared, likely into Philip's treasury. The king had eliminated his debt and seized considerable assets in the process. The Templars' fall was so sudden and complete that it spawned legends that persist today. Stories of hidden treasure, secret knowledge, survival in secret. The Friday the 13th association with bad luck supposedly comes from the date of their arrest, though this connection is likely modern invention. In France, Templar architecture survives. Chapels with their distinctive circular design, modeled on Jerusalem's Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Farm buildings bearing Templar symbols. The Temple Fortress in Paris was destroyed during the French Revolution, but its name remains in the neighborhood called Le Marais. The Templars' story is one of rise and fall, of power and destruction, of how quickly fortune can reverse, from protectors to prisoners, from wealth to ashes, in the space of a few terrible years. Their memory haunts France still, in stones and stories, and the silence of dissolved oaths. The summer of 1789 was hot and tense. France teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. Years of expensive wars, extravagant spending by the monarchy, and an unjust tax system had brought the kingdom to crisis. The poor starved while nobles lived in luxury. Something had to change. Something had to break. King Louis XVI, well-meaning but weak, called the Estates General in May 1789. This assembly, representing clergy, nobility, and commoners, had not met in 175 years. He hoped it would solve the financial crisis. Instead, it unleashed revolution. The Third Estate, representing commoners, demanded real power, not symbolic consultation. When denied, they broke away and formed the National Assembly, declaring they would not disperse until they had written a constitution. This was revolution, though not yet violent. Rumors spread through Paris that the king planned to suppress the assembly with military force. On July 14th, crowds stormed the Bastille, a royal fortress and prison in Paris. They killed the guards, freed the prisoners, and paraded the governor's head through the streets. The revolution had found its symbol and its momentum. The fall of the Bastille triggered uprisings across France. Peasants attacked manor houses, burning records of feudal obligations. The old order crumbled in weeks. The National Assembly abolished feudal privileges, declared the rights of man and of the citizen, and began reorganizing France entirely. The king tried to flee in June 1791, disguised as a servant. He was recognized and brought back to Paris. His attempted escape destroyed what remained of his credibility. He had shown that he opposed the revolution, that he would abandon France rather than accept limitations on royal power. War complicated everything. Austria and Prussia, alarmed by revolution spreading to their borders, threatened France. The Assembly declared war first in April 1792. French armies initially performed poorly, and Paris feared invasion. In this crisis atmosphere, the revolution radicalized. The monarchy was abolished in September 1792. France became a republic. Louis XVI was put on trial for treason. In January 1793, he was executed by guillotine in what is now the Place de la Concorde. His death sent shockwaves through Europe's remaining monarchies. The revolution consumed its own. Moderate revolutionaries like the Girondins were overthrown by more radical Jacobins. Georges Danton, who had helped make the revolution, was later guillotined by it. The pace of change accelerated beyond what anyone had imagined in 1789. The revolution's impact on France was total. The calendar was changed, starting from year one of the Republic. Churches were closed or converted to temples of reason. Streets were renamed. Even forms of address changed, everyone becoming citizen rather than monsieur or Madame. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen proclaimed universal principles: liberty, equality, fraternity. All men are born free and equal. Sovereignty rests with the people. These ideas, radical in 1789, would echo through the next 2 centuries, inspiring revolutions and reform movements around the world. But the French Revolution was not just ideas. It was violence and fear, hope and terror, idealism and brutality mixed together in ways that still disturb. It proved that societies could be fundamentally reorganized, that monarchy was not inevitable, that ordinary people could claim power. It also showed how quickly revolutionary fervor could turn destructive. The revolution that began in 1789 would not truly end until Napoleon's defeat in 1815. 26 years of upheaval that transformed France and sent tremors through every corner of Europe. The world before 1789 and the world after were fundamentally different. The revolution made them so. By 1793, the revolution had entered its most extreme phase. The Reign of Terror, as it came to be called, was a period when fear governed France, when denunciation could mean death, when the guillotine's blade fell daily. Maximilien Robespierre, a lawyer from Arras, became the terror's most prominent figure. He was not a dictator in the traditional sense, but as the leading member of the Committee of Public Safety, his influence was immense. Robespierre believed in the Republic with absolute conviction. He saw enemies everywhere, threats to the revolution that had to be eliminated for the greater good. The guillotine became the revolution's symbol. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin had proposed it as a humane form of execution, more merciful than hanging or breaking on the wheel. The blade fell quickly, death supposedly instantaneous. It was also efficient. Multiple executions could occur in a single day. In Paris, the guillotine stood in the Place de la Révolution. Now, Place de la Concorde. Crowds gathered to watch executions. Some kept count, some knitted while heads fell. The spectacle became routine, normalized in a way that seems incomprehensible now. Marie Antoinette, Louis XVI's widow, went to the guillotine in October 1793. She was 47 years old. Her hair turned white during imprisonment. She stepped on the executioner's foot by accident as she mounted the scaffold. Her last words were an apology. "Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." The terror consumed the revolution's own leaders. The Girondins, who had once been revolutionaries, were now deemed too moderate. Many were executed. Georges Danton, who had helped overthrow the monarchy, argued that the terror had gone too far. For this, he was arrested and guillotined. Before his execution, he reportedly told the executioner, "Show my head to the people. It is worth seeing." No one was safe. Aristocrats died, certainly, but so did peasants accused of hoarding grain, priests who refused, revolutionary loyalty oaths, anyone denounced as an enemy of the Republic. The law of suspects, passed in September 1793, allowed arrest on the vaguest suspicions. Trials were rushed, often lasting minutes. Defense was difficult or impossible. In the provinces, terror took different forms. In the Vendée region, where royalist rebels resisted revolutionary forces, the violence was particularly brutal. Entire villages were destroyed. Rivers ran with blood. Estimates of deaths in the Vendée range from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. the terror ended when it turned on Robespierre himself. Other members of the convention, fearing they would be next, moved against him in July 1794, a date known as 9 Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar. Robespierre was arrested and guillotined the next day, without trial, by the same process he had used against so many others. His death marked the terror's end. The violence subsided. The revolution entered a more moderate phase, though instability continued for years. Estimates of terror deaths vary. In Paris, about 2,600 were guillotined. Across France, perhaps 40,000 died by official execution, and many more in civil conflicts and massacres. The terror lasted roughly a year, but its shadow stretched far longer, a reminder of how idealism can curdle into horror. He was born on Corsica in 1769, when the island had been French for barely a year. His family was minor nobility, his childhood comfortable but not wealthy. He attended military school on the mainland, where his Corsican accent drew mockery. He was small, bookish, brilliant with mathematics and geography. When the revolution came, Napoleon was a young artillery officer. He distinguished himself at the siege of Toulon in 1793, where his tactical skill helped recapture the city from British forces. He was promoted to brigadier general at 24. His rise had begun. In 1795, he defended the revolutionary government against a royalist uprising in Paris. Using artillery loaded with grape shot, he dispersed the mob with what he called a whiff of grape shot. The violence secured his reputation. A year later, he was given command of the Army of Italy. The Italian campaign made him famous. He transformed a poorly supplied, demoralized army into a formidable force. He won battle after battle against Austrian forces, conquering northern Italy and forcing Austria to make peace. He returned to Paris a hero, the Republic's most successful general at 28 years old. An expedition to Egypt followed in 1798. Militarily, it failed. The British destroyed his fleet, stranding the army. But Napoleon managed to return to France, where political chaos created opportunity. In November 1799, he staged a coup, overthrowing the Directory government. He became first consul, effectively France's ruler. As first consul and later as emperor, Napoleon reorganized France comprehensively. He created the Napoleonic Code, a legal system that still influences French law. He reformed education, establishing lycées and universities. He negotiated the Concordat with the Pope, healing the breach between revolutionary France and the Catholic Church. He was not just a general, but an administrator of genius. In 1804, he crowned himself emperor in Notre Dame Cathedral. Pope Pius VII attended, though Napoleon placed the crown on his own head rather than receiving it from the Pope. The symbolism was clear. Napoleon's authority came from himself, not from divine right. His military campaigns dominated Europe. He defeated Austria, Prussia, and Russia repeatedly. By 1810, he controlled most of the continent, directly or through allies and family members installed as rulers. His brothers ruled Spain and Naples. His stepson ruled Italy. Europe had not seen such dominance since Rome, but Russia destroyed him. In 1812, he invaded with over 600,000 men, the largest army Europe had ever seen. The Russians retreated, burning everything behind them. Napoleon reached Moscow, but the city was empty and burning. Winter approached. He began retreat. Russian forces harassed his army constantly. Cold, starvation, and constant attacks destroyed his forces. Fewer than 100,000 survived. After Russia came defeat. At Leipzig in 1813, Allied forces defeated him decisively. He abdicated in April 1814 and was exiled to Elba, a small island off Italy's coast. He escaped in 1815, returned to France, and ruled for 100 days before final defeat at Waterloo. His second exile was to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic. He died there in 1821, possibly of stomach cancer, possibly of arsenic poisoning. His body was returned to Paris in 1840 and now lies under the golden dome of Les Invalides. Napoleon's legacy is complex. He spread revolutionary ideals of legal equality and merit-based advancement across Europe. He also brought endless war, costing millions of lives. He was conqueror and reformer, tyrant and genius. France and Europe both carry his mark, indelible and ambiguous. Among Napoleon's many accomplishments, one outlasted his empire and still shapes the world today. The Napoleonic Code, formerly called the Civil Code of 1804, reorganized French law into a clear, accessible system that ordinary people could understand. Before the Revolution, French law was a patchwork. The North followed customary law, traditions passed down through generations. The South used written law derived from Roman codes. Hundreds of local variations existed. Justice depended on where you lived, what class you belonged to, which noble controlled your region. The Revolution promised legal equality, but created chaos. New laws were passed constantly, contradicting each other, impossible to follow. France needed order, clarity, a foundation on which society could rebuild. Napoleon appointed a commission of 4 legal experts. They worked for 4 years, drafting, debating, revising. Napoleon himself attended many of the meetings, contributing ideas and pushing for practical language rather than legal obscurity. He wanted laws that citizens could read and understand without lawyers interpreting every sentence. The code emerged in 1804, over 2,000 articles organized into 3 sections. The first addressed persons, covering marriage, divorce, parenthood, and civil rights. The second covered property, defining ownership and inheritance. The third addressed how property could be acquired or transferred. The code established fundamental principles. All citizens were equal before the law. Property rights were sacred. Contracts freely entered must be honored. Inheritance would be divided equally among children, ending primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited everything. This single provision transformed French society, breaking up large estates over generations. The code was not perfect. Women had limited rights. A wife needed her husband's permission for many legal acts. Divorce was allowed, but difficult. Children born outside marriage had almost no inheritance rights. By modern standards, the code was patriarchal and restrictive, but for 1804, it represented progress, a rational system replacing feudal privileges. Napoleon exported the code to territories he conquered: Belgium, the Netherlands, parts of Germany, Italy, Poland, all adopted versions of it. Even after Napoleon's defeat, many countries kept the code because it worked better than what they had before. The code's influence spread far beyond Europe. Louisiana, which France had briefly owned before selling it to the United States, retained civil law based on French models. Quebec in Canada uses civil law descended from French codes. Many Latin American countries adopted French legal structures after independence. Japan studied the code when modernizing in the late 19th century. Today, more than 70 countries have legal systems influenced by the Napoleonic Code. It remains the foundation of French law, though amended countless times. Its principles, equality before law, clear property rights, contractual freedom, these became fundamental to modern legal systems worldwide. Napoleon called the code his greatest achievement, more lasting than any military victory. He was right. Empires fall, battles are forgotten, but laws that make society function fairly, these endure. The code was Napoleon's gift to the future, the part of his legacy that brought order instead of conquest. In July 1870, France declared war on Prussia. Napoleon III, nephew of the great Napoleon, believed victory would be swift and would strengthen his regime. He was catastrophically wrong. The Prussian army, led by careful planners and using railways to move troops with unprecedented speed, crushed French forces. Battle after battle ended in Prussian victory. In September, at Sedan, Napoleon III himself was captured along with his entire army. The humiliation was total. Paris refused to surrender. The government collapsed, replaced by a provisional republic. The city prepared for siege. By September, Prussian forces surrounded Paris completely. Nothing entered or left. Food grew scarce, then scarcer. Parisians ate horses, then rats, then the animals from the zoo. The siege lasted 4 months, through one of the coldest winters in years. Balloons carried messages out of the city, floating over Prussian lines. Carrier pigeons brought replies back, but hope faded. In January 1871, Paris capitulated. The war was lost. France would pay a massive indemnity and cede Alsace-Lorraine to the new German Empire, proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles in deliberate humiliation. But Paris had one more shock to deliver. The city's National Guard, armed citizens who defended Paris during the siege, refused to accept defeat or the conservative government that had negotiated it. In March, they seized control of Paris, establishing the Paris Commune. The Commune was remarkable and chaotic. It lasted only 2 months, but in that time, attempted radical reforms. It separated church and state. It postponed rent payments and debt collection. It declared equality for women. It elected workers to positions of power. Artists and intellectuals joined revolutionaries in trying to create a new society. The rest of France watched with horror or fascination. The government, now based in Versailles, assembled troops. In May, they entered Paris to retake it. What followed is called the Bloody Week. Fighting raged street by street, barricade by barricade. The communards fought desperately. In their final act of defiance, they executed hostages, including the Archbishop of Paris, and set fire to public buildings. The Tuileries Palace burned. So did the Hôtel de Ville and parts of the Louvre. Government forces showed no mercy. Summary executions occurred constantly. Bodies lined the streets. Estimates of deaths range from 10,000 to 30,000, most of them communards or suspected sympathizers. Thousands more were arrested, tried, and deported to penal colonies. The Commune's defeat was total, but its memory persisted. Socialists and communists worldwide saw it as the first attempt at proletarian government, a heroic, if doomed, uprising that showed what might be possible. Marx and Lenin both studied it, drawing lessons for future revolutions. For France, the Commune deepened divisions. The left viewed it as martyrdom. The right saw it as anarchy, narrowly defeated. the split between radical Paris and conservative provinces, between workers and bourgeoisie, between revolution and order. These wounds took generations to heal. The Franco-Prussian War ended France's position as Europe's dominant military power. The loss of Alsace-Lorraine created resentment that would fester for 40 years, helping drive France into World War I to reclaim the lost territories. And the Paris Commune left scars that shaped French politics well into the 20th century. 2 months of radical experiment. Decades of consequences. In August 1914, Europe marched into a war that everyone expected to be brief. Troops left for the front with flowers in their rifles, cheered by crowds certain of quick victory. They would be home by Christmas, everyone said. 4 years later, after millions of deaths, the continent lay devastated. World War I was fought across many fronts, but the Western Front, the trenches cutting through France and Belgium, became the war's defining image. The trenches emerged not from planning, but from necessity. In autumn 1914, after the initial German advance was stopped, both sides dug in. Defensive positions, temporary shelters. They were supposed to be transitional. They became permanent. Eventually, trenches stretched from the Swiss border to the English Channel. 450 miles of parallel lines, sometimes separated by only 100 yards, sometimes by miles of cratered moonscape called no man's land. Life in the trenches was misery. Soldiers stood in mud and water, often knee-deep. Trench foot, a rotting condition caused by constant dampness, disabled thousands. Rats were everywhere, growing fat on corpses. Lice tormented everyone regardless of rank. The stench was indescribable, a mixture of death, human waste, and chemical smoke. The routine was boredom, punctuated by terror. Days of waiting, repairing trenches, watching, enduring artillery bombardments that came without warning. Then orders to go over the top, to climb out of the trench and advance across no man's land toward enemy positions. These attacks were slaughter. Machine guns could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. Men fell in waves. Barbed wire entanglements caught those who made it across open ground. Artillery fire from both sides killed attackers and defenders alike. Gains were measured in yards, sometimes just feet, and paid for with thousands of lives. The Battle of Verdun, lasting from February to December 1916, epitomized the war's horror. The Germans intended to bleed France white, to kill so many French soldiers that France would collapse. The battle became the longest and one of the deadliest of the war. Approximately 300,000 soldiers died. The front barely moved. The Battle of the Somme, July to November 1916, was Britain's bloodiest day, occurred on July 1st, when nearly 20,000 British soldiers died in a single day. The battle continued for months, achieving almost nothing strategically. Over 1 million men were killed or wounded on both sides. New weapons made the war even more terrible. Poison gas, first used effectively by Germany in 1915, caused agonizing deaths or permanent injury. Flamethrowers turned trenches into infernos. Tanks appeared, clumsy and unreliable at first, but pointing toward future warfare. Aircraft, initially used for reconnaissance, began fighting each other, creating the image of the fighter race, young men dueling in the sky above the slaughter below. French soldiers mutinied in 1917 after another failed offensive. Not desertion, but refusal to engage in more pointless attacks. The mutinies were suppressed, but they forced French commanders to change tactics, to stop the wasteful assaults that achieved nothing but death. The war ended on November 11, 1918. Armistice, not victory. Germany collapsed internally, its army still on foreign soil, but its people starving and rebellious. The guns fell silent. Soldiers emerged from trenches into a landscape of devastation. Northern France was destroyed, villages erased, fields poisoned and cratered. France lost 1.4 million soldiers. Millions more were wounded, many permanently disabled. An entire generation was decimated. The scars, physical and psychological, would never fully heal. In May 1940, German forces invaded France. The campaign was swift and devastating, using mobile warfare, tanks and aircraft coordinating in ways that French commanders did not anticipate. Germany shattered French defenses in weeks. The government fled Paris. On June 14th, German troops marched into the capital without resistance. Paris had been declared an open city to spare it from destruction. The Wehrmacht paraded down the Champs-Élysées. Swastika flags hung from the Arc de Triomphe and the Eiffel Tower. The unthinkable had happened. France had fallen. The armistice signed on June 22nd was deliberately humiliating. It was signed in the same railway car where Germany had signed the armistice ending World War I. Adolf Hitler danced a little jig at the sight, his victory complete. France was divided. The North and Atlantic coast came under direct German occupation. The South became a nominally independent state governed from the spa town of Vichy, led by Marshal Philippe Pétain, the aged hero of World War I. The Vichy regime collaborated with Germany. It passed anti-Jewish laws before Germany even demanded them. It helped round up Jews for deportation. It sent French workers to Germany as forced labor. Vichy claimed to be preserving French sovereignty, but it became a puppet, implementing Nazi policies while maintaining a pretense of independence. But not all French accepted defeat. Charles de Gaulle, a junior general who had escaped to London, refused to surrender. On June 18, 1940, he broadcast a radio address from London. "France has lost a battle," he declared, "but France has not lost the war." He called for resistance, for French forces and civilians to continue fighting. Few heard the broadcast initially, but it became the symbolic beginning of Free France. Inside France, resistance organized slowly. Small groups formed, printing underground newspapers, helping Allied airmen escape, gathering intelligence. The risks were enormous. Captured resistors faced torture and execution. Entire families could be punished for one member's actions. Yet the resistance grew. The Maquis, rural resistance groups, formed in remote areas, especially after Germany began forced labor conscription in 1943. Young men fled to the countryside rather than work in German factories. They needed shelter, food, weapons. Sympathetic civilians helped. Gradually, these scattered groups became organized forces. London, and later the OSS, American intelligence, supplied weapons and agents. Radio operators, often women, maintained communication despite German direction-finding efforts that made their work desperately dangerous. Sabotage increased. Railways were blown up. Collaborators were assassinated. Germans retaliated brutally. In Oradour-sur-Glane, in June 1944, SS troops massacred 642 civilians, burning the village in reprisal for resistance activity nearby. The resistance's finest hour came during and after D-Day, in June 1944. Across France, resistance groups rose up, cutting railways, ambushing German columns, disrupting communications. They prevented German reinforcements from reaching Normandy quickly, contributing significantly to the invasion's success. Paris liberated itself. On August 19, 1944, police and resistance fighters began an uprising. Barricades went up across the city. Fighting lasted for days. On August 25th, French and American forces entered Paris. De Gaulle arrived the same day, walking down the Champs-Élysées in triumph. The occupation was over, but liberation revealed divisions. What to do with collaborators? Thousands were executed, often in summary justice. Women accused of relationships with Germans had their heads shaved and were paraded through streets. The purge, or epuration, was chaotic and sometimes unjust, driven by rage and settling of old scores. France had survived, but 4 years of occupation left deep wounds: guilt over collaboration, pride in resistance, grief for losses. These emotions tangled together. France had been defeated, occupied, divided, then liberated. The experience shaped the nation's self-understanding for decades to come. By August 1944, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy and were advancing toward Paris. General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, initially planned to bypass the city. Paris had no strategic value, and urban fighting would be costly. The Allies needed to keep moving toward Germany, but Paris would not wait. On August 19th, the city's police went on strike, then seized the prefecture. Resistance groups distributed weapons hidden for years. Barricades appeared on streets, furniture and paving stones piled into improvised fortifications. The insurrection had begun without Allied permission. The German commander, General Dietrich von Choltitz, had orders from Hitler to destroy Paris rather than let it fall intact. Explosives had been placed on bridges, at Notre Dame, at the Eiffel Tower. Hitler demanded that Paris burn. Von Choltitz hesitated. The Swedish consul, Raoul Nordling, negotiated with him, appealing to his sense of history. Would he be remembered as the man who destroyed one of the world's most beautiful cities? Fighting spread across Paris. Germans held strong points. Resistance fighters controlled neighborhoods. Casualties mounted. The resistance was outgunned and running out of ammunition. Messages were sent to Allied commanders. Paris needs help. Paris is fighting. Come quickly. De Gaulle insisted that French forces enter Paris first. The French 2nd Armored Division under General Leclerc was ordered to take the city. They raced toward Paris on August 24th, driving through the night. The first tanks entered the city center that evening. The next morning, August 25th, von Choltitz surrendered at the Hotel Meurice, his headquarters. He had not destroyed the city. His reasons remain debated. Perhaps Nordling's appeals worked. Perhaps he recognized Germany had lost and saw no point in a final atrocity. Perhaps he simply disobeyed orders. Whatever his reasons, Paris survived. That afternoon, de Gaulle arrived. He went to the prefecture, then to Notre Dame for a Thanksgiving service. As he walked down the Champs-Élysées, shots rang out. Snipers, likely collaborationist militia, fired from rooftops. The crowd scattered. De Gaulle continued walking, refusing to run, showing no fear. The image became legendary. De Gaulle tall and calm amid chaos, the embodiment of French dignity restored. The liberation cost approximately 3,000 lives, mostly resistance fighters and civilians. But Paris was free. The occupation was over. France had liberated its own capital, a source of immense pride. That evening, church bells rang across the city for the first time in 4 years. People danced in the streets. Wine flowed. The relief was overwhelming. 4 years of fear, hunger, humiliation, collaboration, and resistance had ended. Paris lived. France would survive. The war continued for 9 more months, but for Paris, the darkest time had passed. The city of light glowed again, battered but unbroken, its spirit intact. And so, our journey through France comes to rest. We have wandered through mountains and valleys, through centuries of stories, through the quiet corners of a land that has shaped so much of the world. Let these images fade now like evening light. Let your breathing deepen and your thoughts drift away. France will still be there tomorrow, waiting with more stories. But for now, simply rest. Thank you for listening. Sleep well, and good night.